Hey, what's up? Welcome back to Offshore Audio. I'm Andrew, and this is a channel where I'm bringing you tips and tricks to be a better live sound engineer or to get started in your live sound engineering career. We all like mixing bands, don't we? We all like music. Quite a lot of the time, that's why we get into this profession. I also very much enjoy mixing bands. So today I thought I would share with you my process of setting up the mixer for a gig. What do I do to prepare my mixer before the band comes in? And maybe I'll save it as a cheeky preset so that I can just load that up when I've got a new gig coming up. Why have a plan anyway? Like, why organize your mixer before the band comes in? Why not just get the band on stage first and then play it by ear? When you're mixing a band, there's a lot going on. There are a lot of inputs. You know, there's easy 25, 30 inputs going on for one band. If you're mixing smaller bands in smaller venues, quite often you have multiple bands per night. You've got to do the monitors from the front of house console. There's really quite a lot happening. Why throw that up to chance? You need to have a really good plan for how you're going to tackle all of these problems as they come up. The more that you can prepare in advance, the easier your life is going to be. So we're going to look at testing and setting effects and graphics, labeling, the processing, routing, and then finally we'll look at a bit of file management. Let's have a look at the mixer. Okay, so how do I go about setting up a mixer? First thing I do is I set up a microphone to check the sound and use as a talkback. So I'll just plug a microphone into the back of the mixer, usually on the last channel that I'm going to use. So this is channel 32 in this mixer. I'll gain it up to make sure that I've got a good signal. And then I will turn my master up. I'll turn the microphone up and I'll check to see if I have sound to make sure that my amplifiers are on and that my PA sounds all right. I'll usually also pan it left and right to make sure that each side of the PA is playing and I'm not just hearing one side of it. Next up, I will use it to check my monitor wedges. So to do that, I need to make sure that my monitor sends, my monitor buses, these are the masters for the monitors, are up and unmuted. And after that, it's just to select them and then using either the fader flip or if you have a rotary encoder, I'll send it to the monitors one by one to make sure that I have sound. After that, I'm going to set up some graphic EQs to make sure that I have a way of controlling the sound of all of my speakers. So I'm going to go to the Effects tab here. It might be called a rack on your mixer, but wherever you find your graphic EQs. And you'll see I've already got some preset up. That's just how this mixer defaults. The first three are dual EQs, which means that it's two EQ units in one effects area. And the last one is stereo, which means that the two EQs are linked. So we're going to go down to the stereo one. We're going to set that EQ to affect the main mix, the left-right. And you see, because it's linked, when I press that once, it's changed both of them. The last thing to do is to press insert, which inserts it into the signal path, means the EQ will work. And then we can move on to the monitors. So we just scroll up to them and we're going to do the same thing, but we'll select the buses, the monitor buses, so that we're affecting the monitors. So just scroll along to bus 1 for this one, bus 2 for the second, and then remember to insert them. And we'll just do the same with the second graphic EQ, except we'll do it on bus 3 and bus 4, and remember to insert it. I usually then head to my graphic EQ for my stereo output, my main left-right, and I'll chuck the EQ on the faders, and I'll do quick adjustments using that microphone that I set up earlier to make sure I don't have any real big feedback problems or anything. I'll then come out of that, and I'll follow suit on the monitors. So I'll do the first monitor, and then I can use this to scroll through the two EQs on this one unit. I'll do the second monitor and so on and so forth. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my effects. So in this M32, they're in the same place. On your mixer, they might be in a different place. But what we want to do is we want to go into our effects, make sure that we have what we need. So for me, 2 reverbs and a delay. That's pretty much what I'm looking for usually. And I'll just make sure as well, I'll use that microphone to send some sound to them and I'll test to see how it sounds and adjust the parameters to get a sound that I like. Now, when I'm done doing that, it's really important, again, to check that the buses that we're using to send to the effects are on. So you can see here, it's bus 13 through 16. So I'll just go to this menu here to go to the appropriate buses. You can see they're already up and unmuted by default, but there's one more step that we need to do. We need to go and check that our return channels are also up and unmuted. On this mixer, I just press effects returns, and on the left-hand side, you see that they're already up and unmuted. But it's quite common on a lot of mixers that they begin muted. So what have we done? So far, I've set up a microphone for talkback to my musicians. I've checked that I have sound in all of the monitor wedges and PA.
I've got some graphic EQs on all my speakers and I've done adjustments to them. And I have set up my effects units that I'm going to use through the gig. Of course, we can fine tune these, but now we have a starting point. What next?
After I've got all of those things set up, it's time to get the inputs labeled on the mixer. First of all, do we have an input list? If we have an input list, amazing. Now we know what the band are bringing within a certain degree of accuracy. If the band has a touring sound engineer that's coming with them, label that desk absolutely how it's written in the rider. Quite often, if it's me that's going to be mixing the band, I'll rearrange the rider to suit me, how I like to have my channels laid out on the mixer. And I've got my own sort of flow that I like to have when I'm laying them out. I usually begin with the drums. I'll take the bass drum first, snare, toms, overheads, that kind of thing. And then I'll add percussion in just after the drums. Bass instruments, acoustic guitars, electric guitars, DI instruments like synthesizers and stuff, and I'll round it off with vocals at the end. Now, what if you don't have an input list? Time to get some research done. I'll end up going on Spotify, on Facebook, on Instagram. I will look everywhere for some sort of sign of life from this band, and I'll listen to them. And by listening to them, I can kind of get an idea of like, is it a rock band? Are there going to be 5 synths? Is there a horn section or not? And really that can help me to sort of create a basic channel list that I can later edit. Why bother taking the time to label the desk before the band even gets there? When things get hectic, having everything where you intend it to be is so important. If you plug a guitar in, you go to the mixer, you gain it up, and you see that, in fact, it's coming in on the bass channel, you know that maybe you've plugged the XLR into the wrong channel. That's something you want to find out now, not later on. And remember that something plugged in wrong that you can't find later is going to cost you way more time down the line when everything else is plugged in and the stage is busy than it will now if you just label everything correctly.
So what I tend to do is I tend to try and get my settings dialed in before the sound check, if at all possible. I know from experience roughly where I'm going to start with things like my drums. So I'll start with my compression. I'll go to my compressor and I know that I'm probably going to have slightly longer attack on my drum compression. So what I will do is I will just set those settings in my compressor and I'll just make sure that the threshold is all the way up and my compressor is engaged. I'll go through the other instruments as well, like my bass. I'll maybe go for a more medium attack. And then again, for my vocals, I'll probably go for a faster sort of attack and release. And, you know, if I'm going to use it on acoustic, I'll make sure that I've got a kind of reasonable attack and release and a low ratio because I don't want to compress it too hard. But the point is that I will dial in my settings for each instrument that I might use it on. And then I will turn the compressor on and I will leave the threshold right up. And that means when it's time to sound check, when I want to get my compression, I just grab my threshold and I pull it down until I get the compression that I want. I don't need to spend time dialing in settings when the band is on the stage. So usually I'll add compression to my drums, sometimes acoustic guitar, always bass and always vocals. And then it depends what else turns up. But next up is also gating. Because if you're not using gates on your drums, you're probably going to end up with quite a lot of low end feedback because they're very resonant. So I will again make sure that a gate is enabled on all of my shells. That's the drum shells. And I'll make sure that the threshold is right down so that I always hear the instrument before I start. And then I will bring the threshold up when I start sound checking. The last thing I'll do processing wise is high pass filters. I'm pretty much going to high pass everything except proper bass instruments to some degree. So I won't high pass the kick, but I'll go through all my other instruments and I will engage my high pass called low cut here. And then I'll dial it into where I think I might need it. A good rule that I use is I tend to go for about 80 to 100 hertz on most instruments, but I'll keep it quite a lot lower on the toms, maybe 50 hertz or so. I know that I'm going to want some of that low-end information in those toms. They need to have impact. So where are we now in the process? We've tested our system and we've set up all of our effects. We know that our monitors work and we know that we're ready to mix the band. We've got our processing ready so we can dial in compression and gating whenever we want. And we've set our high pass filters so that we don't get any unwanted low end feedback. Now I'm going to get to routing. On most mixers, you have what are called DCAs or VCAs, and they're just sort of virtual control faders. It's a master fader for a smaller group of instruments. So I will then set up DCAs for my drums, my bass, my guitars, my keys, my specials, can we say, whether that's horns or whatever, wind instruments, violins, also my vocals. But I will go one step further than that, and I'm also going to set up DCAs for the effects returns for my vocal reverb and for my delay. So we'll call this one my vocal reverb, and this one's going to be my delay. Now, why do I do that? Well, first of all, I make all these DCAs for all of the instruments because mixer real estate is a lot smaller on the sort of smaller digital mixers. You sort of fine tune your mix here, get it how you want, but then you have a larger fader for just your drums as a whole versus your bass as a whole. So you're mixing these sort of larger elements of the mix on your VCAs, and you don't need to go paging through loads of pages to find things. Also, if you need to suddenly mute something, you've got it here. Though it's worth noting that if you mute a DCA here, it'll only mute it to the front of house. You'll still get sound going to your monitors and other places that you've routed it. But why do I make a DCA for my vocal reverb and my delay? The vocal reverb, that's easy. I want to be able to mute my vocal reverb whenever the vocalist is just speaking to the audience in between songs. But also, I want to be able to ride it. You know, when it comes to a chorus, I want to give it a lift in that reverb if it needs it. And it's much easier to do that here instead of going into the vocal and turning up the send, or like trying to find the effects bus and flip the fader and find the vocal channel so that you can turn it up. And then what if you have 5 vocals? A lot easier to just turn the return up via a DCA. Also, the delay. Usually, I will just have delay on the vocal channels, but I'll have the DCA turned down, so there's no delay coming out the speakers. At the start of every song, I can tap in the tap tempo using one of my control keys here. And then, if there comes a chorus or a point where I think there needs to be delay, I can just bring this fader up to the point where I want to hear it. And then the best thing is, because I have this DCA controlling the return from the effects, if I whack this down, no more effect. As opposed to if you took the send down, you would still hear the decay of the reverb or the delay. When you bring the return down via this DCA, you cut it immediately. So I can use this to ride the effects of that vocal while I'm mixing. So now we've basically prepped our whole mixer. We know that we've got sound and everything, it's routed correctly. We've labeled all of our microphone inputs, we've set all of our processing up, we've got the DCAs and everything labeled. So now it's just time to save it. So you find whatever scenes or show files or whatever way that you're going to save it on your mixer, you just page over, and then you can save it as your sort of pre-sound check scene. We're just going to call it 1. And this is your pre-sound check scene. So you can just hold this as it is. And when your first band comes in, you can create a scene for them. You've got all of these settings created. You just go to your next scene and you save a new one, and you would call it, you know, band 1 or something. We'll just call it B1 because this mixer is horrific to control. So you then go through, you do your sound check, you dial in your dynamics, your gates, you get your EQ sorted for everything. And then when you're finished, you can just go back to your scenes and you save over B1 because now you're ready. That's B1 ready for the show. And then the next band comes into soundcheck, and you know what you can do? You can just load your pre-soundcheck scene. Remember the one that I called 1? You've now defaulted the mixer again back to that initial setting that you spent all that time creating. And then you just save a new scene and you can just call that B2. So there you go.
So what I like to do is I like to have a sort of festival patch, shall we call it. I kind of have a preset, my catch-all for bands. If I have enough channels on the mixer, so like 32 is usually enough for a band, I just have input channels for just about everything that I'm going to plug in on the stage. And you know, if the band comes with one less guitar, that's fine. I just don't plug something into that guitar channel. Or, you know, if the band comes with one extra of something, I can just substitute out one of the other channels and squeeze my new instrument into that channel there. I'll quite often have things like specials that might be horns, they might be extra synths, they might be strings, basically some channels that I can just do what I want with. And they're assigned to their own groups. And then when I get those surprises, I know that those surprises fit in a nice little section on my mixer, but the rest of the band is sort of fairly self-explanatory. And this really improves your workflow as well, because you start to have a sort of mental note of where you're going to plug everything. Is it the kick in? Channel 1. Kick out? 2. Snare bottom? 4. And you can kind of look at a patch bay and know that, yeah, okay, 1 to 10 are my drums. And that allows you to work so much quicker when you're short of time. Without consulting a channel list on the stage, you know where everything's supposed to go. Having said that, what I've done is I've created a sort of festival patch for the M32 that I used in this video. And I'll leave a link to that in the description down below. So you can click on that link and go and check out my patch and see how I've labeled the disc. You can use it yourself if you want to get a head start on mixing a gig, download it and have a look. And now let me know, do you work with bands? If so, how do you go about it? Or do you want to work with bands? Is that what you're interested in? Let me know if there's any other way that I can help. But for now, thanks a lot, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.